Hi again, and welcome to another video in my series. But this time I'm going to have a break from attempting to debunk what I view are myths associated with landscape photography. Common theme in what I'm trying to do is to tackle things from a slightly different perspective. And what I'm going to do in today's video is to look at taking pictures for other people. Now, I guess we all do that to some extent if we put pictures up on social media or on the web, but what I'm specifically looking at here is taking pictures as a volunteer for an organisation that has specific uses for them. Now, 5 years ago I moved up from Somerset to Worcestershire to a house adjacent to the National Trust property of Croom, and being a National Trust member I walk my dog almost every day in Croom, and fairly early on I bumped into Croom's publicity and marketing officer who was taking photos in the park, but bemoaning the fact that pressures of work meant that she didn't really have the time to get the images she needed for publicity purposes. So I offered to take some pictures and started sending them off on an ad hoc basis, and eventually formalised a relationship and became a photographic volunteer for Croom. And as part of supplying images to Croom, also have supplied images to the National Trust centrally, and some of my images are now on the National Trust image site. So what I want to do in this video is to show some 25 pictures that I have taken specifically to submit to the National Trust. And I talk about the composition in terms of their end use rather than my personal aesthetic view of the reasons I took the picture. So I'm talking about taking the picture in context of the person who will be using them rather than necessarily my personal preferences for composition. And so I hope this will give you a slightly different approach to looking at pictures than maybe some of the other YouTube videos where you get people talking very much about a picture from their own particular perspective. So I'm going to move on now and run through the 25 images. I'm going to start this sequence with what in landscape terms is a fairly banal photo, but that's really rather the point if you're taking pictures for other people. What you're looking for may not necessarily be the same as what they're looking for. And in terms of a visitor to Croom Park, this is probably the first sight that they will get having entered the park from the visitor's reception. So this image, although it's fairly straightforward, nothing exciting about the lighting, is a fairly accurate impression of what they'll see, and so fits into the brief that I had. This is now getting to be something possibly a little bit more interesting to a landscape photographer. A classic view of the house across the lake. This was taken on a calm day, so the reflections are pretty good. It's taken in autumn, so the tree colours are nice, and although it looks fairly saturated, I haven't enhanced the saturation. This was just the way the picture looked. So from this point of view of a landscape photograph, this is quite reasonable. In terms of my brief, to try and persuade people that Croom is a nice place to visit, I think it fits that as well. Another picture really that fits both briefs. This was taken early in, I think it was a November morning. So we've got Croom Court, the house at the back, and in the front here we've got what's known as the Chinese Bridge. And this is a replica built to the original plans of a bridge that was created when the park was first established by Capability Brown. Now this image again hopefully conveys the impression that Croom is a nice place to visit. It was used locally on Croom's social media pages. It was also used on the Midlands regional site for the landing page of their website, and so this image has got me quite a lot of exposure. Another image showing what there is to see at Croom, again not particularly exciting from a landscape photographer's point of view, but it fits the brief. It shows what people will see. This church conveys an interesting backstory in that it was actually created when the park was established, and the previous church, along with the village housing the farm workers, was actually moved. So there is a story that can be related to this image, which possibly gives it better value in terms of the National Trust who I'm taking the picture for. Another thing that the landed gentry did back in the 1700s to impress their friends and neighbours was to create interesting looking buildings dotted around their estate, and this is known as Croom's Rotunda, and it contains some very impressive plaster friezes. So this will be on the viewing circuit of a lot of visitors. So again, it shows what the building is like. I've taken pictures of this building throughout the seasons, but obviously anybody fancies a walk on a winter's day, then this is one of the stopping points. It's not just about landscapes and buildings, but a lot of people visit National Trust properties, particularly where there's parks and gardens, to look at the wildlife. And so this picture of swans, again, is not a particularly impressive or exciting picture, but the reason I included it is because the swans are in front of the bridge as a backdrop, so it clearly links the wildlife to the site, and that was the reason that I looked for this, rather than any intrinsic artistic merit, was really context, the story behind the image. Another picture of the bridge. Now we're heading into late autumn, probably early winter. Frosty morning, a little bit of mist, so quite a nice atmospheric shot, and again trying to convey to potential visitors the sorts of scenery that they might see on a visit to the site. Don't tend to take a lot of monochrome images for Croom, but this one I took really because again it conveys the atmosphere that you might see if you decide to take a walk in the winter. And I guess we've all got to the stage where we've got getting cabin fever when the weather's poor and we decide we might like to go out for a walk. And this really just tends to show that even under grey conditions there are interesting things to see, and so this might be a worthwhile place for a walk. Another shot of the bridge, pushing my brief a little bit here in the sense that this isn't quite how somebody would see the picture, because I've used a wide angle lens and there's been a little bit of distortion here that's elongated the bridge, but again it conveys the atmosphere of the landscape and might encourage somebody that this was a worthwhile place to come for a walk. Another winter scene, again conveying atmosphere, and I tend to take the same sorts of shots at different seasons, whereas I might not take them purely for my own interest. If I'm shooting for them in the National Trust, they would tend to rotate their images according to the seasons, and then this again conveys the sorts of atmosphere you might encounter in a winter walk. Again, another atmospheric shot. It's just shot this because it's calm. It conveys a sense of calm and peace, and for somebody looking to avoid the rat race or possibly have a wind down after a busy week, this conveys an impression of solitude and peace that again might be attractive to a prospective visitor. This is an interesting picture in terms of the use that it got. I first of all sent it to Croom for potential use on their social media, and they did put it up on social media, and just highlighting the issue of the brief, taking pictures that will encourage people to come but not leave them feeling disappointed. One of the comments on this image was, "Lovely image, but I'll never see it because it was obviously taken when the park was closed," which is true. But there are broader applications to an image of this sort, and not only was it used by Croom, it was used by the National Trust centrally to help promote their 125th year centenary, particularly highlighting their stewardship of wildlife and places of beauty. So although I have a brief, it's also worth considering the wider aims and objectives of the organisation to see if there are images that might be useful centrally that perhaps are less valid locally. Another picture that conveys an atmosphere, this again on a winter's morning, very cold day, ice on the lake. This was used by Croom for their social media, but it was also used by local hospice to promote a charity walk they were holding at Croom. So it has applications beyond the National Trust. This was a picture that I don't think the National Trust have used. I think I did submit it to them. I took it for me because I like the scenery, I like the colour, I like the composition, but particularly what struck me was the contrails and the reflection of the contrails, highlighting the disparity between a traditional British landscape scene and the impact of modern transport. So there is a narrative there beyond the simple aesthetics of the picture. This is another view of the lake, again really to convey atmosphere, that this is a nice place to come to, again a little early in the morning possibly for visitors, but it does serve to highlight the wildlife. We have cormorants sitting in the trees ready to dry their wings when the sun gets a little bit higher. So there are a number of stories that relate to that particular image. Again, another image with a story, although I have to admit I didn't realise the story when I took the image. I shot this in monochrome because I really was struck by the shapes and the composition and by the fact there wasn't much colour in the scene. But the reason there's a story to this is that 2 years after I took this shot, this tree here blew down in the wind. And it highlights the fact that a lot of these estates that were established in the 1700s and trees were planted then, these trees are coming to the end of their life and starting to die and fall over. And reading comments from volunteers at other sites, this is not a unique occurrence to Croom. So there is a story to be told there, and if you visit now, the scene will be very different because this tree no longer exists. Another classic autumn-winter scene, probably would have been taken in October rather than November. This was taken a couple of years ago. Again, sort of highlights Croom as a nice place to visit. And as it happens, this is the image that Croom are currently using on the landing page of their site to highlight their activities. This is really just to illustrate the issue of post-processing. There is a big debate on the extent to which you should post-process images and use AI to replace skies. There's no sky replacement here, but bearing in mind my brief, I did enhance the sky, so the scene as it was in front of me was a little less dramatic than that. But the criteria that I used was, could the sky be that dramatic? And although it wasn't on that occasion, I have seen skies that dramatic at Croom. So I felt that it was not conveying an unreasonable representation of what a visitor might see. Similarly with this one, this is another autumn shot taken a couple of years ago. Again, it looks like I've enhanced the saturation, but I haven't. This was a frosty morning. You can see the mist down here. But higher up, because of the frost, the atmosphere is really very clear. There's not much atmospheric haze higher up. There's nothing to obscure the sun, which is coming in from this angle. Very harsh light, and it really is lighting up these trees. And this was an image that National Trust wanted for their central social media. This is an image I took for me because I like the juxtaposition of the large tree and the small tree. But even in that, there is a narrative. Because again, this is a tree coming to the end of its life, having probably been planted at the time Capability Brown was designing the estate. And the National Trust, recognising this tree hasn't got much longer to go, has planted a replacement to ensure continuity. So there is an environmental narrative that goes beyond the immediate aesthetic impact of the picture. This is just simply in-your-face autumn colours, nice place to walk. If you like autumn colours, it's fine. It may well encourage a visit. I don't think it has any great artistic value as a landscape photograph. Jumped ahead there. As I said, wildlife is going to be an important consideration for some visitors, so it's nice to get some picturesque pictures of the wildlife. And so this is a nice image of swans on a summer day. It doesn't actually shout Croom. It was taken on the lake, but unlike the picture of the swan in front of the bridge, it doesn't actually link it to the property on its own. There's another story another picture with a slight backstory. 2 grey-lag geese with their young. This was taken 2 or 3 years ago, and the backstory is that since then Croom has become the habitat for otters on a fairly frequent basis, and the downside of that is that since the otters have arrived we tend not to see chicks. So it is the balance of nature. As one species becomes more prevalent, others suffer. Another shot of the wildlife at Croom. Because there are quite a lot of visitors, the wildlife does come quite accustomed to people, and it's often possible to get quite close. In the case of cormorants, it's easy enough to get close when they're in a tree. They tend to be much more skittish when they're on water. They obviously feel more vulnerable then. But this was taken from the bottom of the tree and is something that somebody could quite easily see, particularly in the winter months. And this is the final picture, and I spent a little bit more time on this. This is one of the few pictures that I've taken where I set out specifically with this shot in mind. And the reason for that is that these cows here, Aberdeen Angus, are used to manage the grassland at Croom. And the other side of the environmental story is these are purely grass-fed cows. So it is a double environmental story. It's an environmentally friendly way to produce beef, and it's an environmentally friendly way to manage the landscape at Croom, particularly during the time when staff are furloughed, and so there isn't the staff available to use machinery to cut the grass in front of the house. So this year these cows have been grazing over a much wider area. So there's a clear environmental narrative here, and the decision to use a wide-angle lens was very much because the cows are the story and the house is the setting. I didn't want to use a standard length or a telephoto length lens that meant the house would dominate the cows. I see all too often pictures in presentations on YouTube where people have taken photos of cairns at the top of hills or mountains with a wide-angle lens where the cairn is maybe 20-30% of the frame like the cows are here, but the background is maybe say a mountain maybe 4 or 5 miles away in the background, and the least interesting element of the frame is highlighted by the fact that the wide angle stretches perspective. In this case, because the cows are the story and the house is very large, I wanted to use that perspective to actually reduce the significance to tell the story. So again, it highlights that depending on the application of the image that you envisage, the impact on the composition you choose can be modified. So that concludes my run through of the 25 pictures. That represents a fraction of the images that I've put in my gallery on 500px entitled Croom Court. So there's something like 127 pictures there, so if you're interested in looking at a wider range of pictures, then you can go to my 500px site, look at that gallery, give you an idea of the wider context. Not all of those pictures have been submitted to the National Trust, but some have. If you're interested to see what images of mine the National Trust have chosen to put on their images site, and that is the commercial site they use to sell images, and it's a curated site. So if they've chosen it, it's because they feel it has some value to their audience. Then if you go to NT Images and type in my name into the search box, that will show up my images, and I think there's something like 170 images on there. So hopefully that gives you an insight to what I do as a volunteer. I'm sure everybody's slightly different in what they do, but hopefully you found it interesting. Maybe give you a slightly different way of looking at opportunities for use of your pictures. And I hope you found it interesting. And again, thank you very much for watching.